Okay, tonight is Genesis chapter 50.
And Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 60 days.
At the very end of chapter 49, we had read that Jacob had passed away after speaking to each of his sons one by one. And so now as chapter 50 begins, you see what happens after that. It says Jacob fell upon his father's face, wept upon him, kissed him, and so forth, okay, at his father's death. And remember that even that moment was prophesied some years earlier when Jacob had been invited to come to Egypt, that he went to God in prayer, and the Lord told him, "Go, I'll be with you, and you'll be reunited with your son." And said that Joseph shall put his hand upon your eyes. Right? And of course, as we explained then in Genesis chapter 46, that meant that when the relative died and you were there, you were a close relative, if the eyes were open, you closed the eyes. So we assume that that's what happened here, is the Lord told Jacob that that's what would happen. So here Joseph is with him at this time of his death. You see verse 2, and then he's going to now start to take care of what has to be done, the preparing for the funeral, burial, and so forth. So it says he commanded the physicians to embalm him, right? And it says that 40 days were fulfilled. It's my understanding that the embalming process at the time took 40 days to be considered concluded. I guess between the time that it was done and then maybe a certain amount of time for it to take effect. So it was a 40-day process. And then also the mourning period for someone like Jacob would have been 30 days. So that's where the number of days are coming in verse 3. It says 40 days were fulfilled, for so fulfilled the days of those which were embalmed, and the Egyptians mourned for him 60 days, which is 70, which is 40 plus 30. So that's where the different numbers come in. Right? So here Jacob has been embalmed, and Joseph is overseeing this. Then there was a period of mourning for him, at which, at the conclusion of that time, that they would go ahead and proceed with the burial. Now, the reason that the body had to be embalmed, obviously not all bodies were embalmed at the time. There was, I'm sure, some expense to it, and some trouble, and some period of time, etc. Well, if you remember, Jacob's one request to Joseph was, "Don't bury me in Egypt. Take me back to Canaan, take my body back to Canaan, and bury me alongside Abraham and Isaac and their wives and so forth." Right? So the body has to be preserved until such time as they can make that journey and proceed with that burial. So that's the reason for the embalming. So that's the reason all these number of days had to pass: 40 for the embalming, 30 for the mourning period, 70 altogether.
And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Lo, I die. In my grave which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan, there shalt thou bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury thy father, according as he made thee swear.
So the period of mourning is over. In verse 4 it says that that's done. It says now Joseph issues a request to the Pharaoh, basically asking for permission to accompany the body of his father to Canaan for the burial. Now you might say, why do he need permission? Well, in essence, that was his job, was in Pharaoh's court, in Pharaoh's service. He had spent a lot of time as number 2 in command, overseeing the distribution of the food. Now that's done now, because at the time that Jacob came to Egypt, it was 5 years to go. Now 17 years have passed since that point. So the end of the famine should be 12 years in the past at this point. So that was not his job now, but again, you would assume, since he proved himself a worthy servant and a valuable, I'll say, employee during that period of time, that the Pharaoh would have kept him in an important position in his administration. So, Joseph needed time off. This was not going to be, we go to a funeral today, you go this morning and it's done, and you know, you can be back at work tomorrow, but this is not like that, right? That they're going to have to travel to Canaan, however long that was going to take, however long the whole thing with the funeral is going to take there. It's a certain number of days to carry that out, and then finally to return. You know. Now, and also, I believe that yeah, the Pharaoh may have wanted indication that Joseph was in fact coming back, because in Egypt this was not their land. You know, they have been living here for many years now, but on the other hand, obviously he doesn't want to lose him to say he's going to go off and never return, so he had to give that assurance that he would return, which it says at the end of verse 5, where he says that, now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. So he is indicating that he's going to come back. Now the Pharaoh in verse 6 says, fine, you know, go ahead and take care of it, right? But the you know, the reason that he gives for doing it, I mean, shows why perhaps he was willing to go along with this. Right, in verse 6 it says, go up and bury thy father according as he made thee swear. See, in verse 5, he has said that you know, Jacob made him basically swear that he would bury his body in Canaan and not in Egypt. So the you know, this kind of a declaration, this kind of a promise made to somebody who's dying, kind of their dying wish, carries a lot of weight with somebody like the Pharaoh. You know, more so maybe than just the sentimentality of burying your father. Is that, okay, you know, this was your father as he was dying, his dying wish was to take his body to Canaan to be buried, so since you have sworn to do that, you need to follow through and do that now. So that's his response, all right? He says, you know, since your father made you swear to do this, fine, take all the time you need, take his body, go to Canaan, bury it, and then come back when you're done.
And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. And all the house of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company.
So Joseph and his family and the whole group of people make the trip to Canaan to take care of the funeral. Right? And as it says here in these verses, should show you some ideas of the people who went. It was quite a large group. Right? It says that with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, the elders of the land of Egypt. Again, whoever that refers to, so some number of servants and attendants, in addition to all the family members, right? Ate all the house of Joseph and his brethren. It means all of his brothers, all of their families, right, in his father's house. Everybody went for the funeral. It says everyone except the little ones, which I guess probably would have been, you know, grandchildren by this point. So the little ones may have, you know, been too little to make the trip. So obviously they lived home alone. I'm sure there was people there to take care of them. But pretty much everybody who could go went. So it was a large group that went. And as you see in 9, it says they went up with him both chariots, horsemen. It was a very great company. So this was a big deal. This was, you know, their father, grandfather, the patriarch of the family, you know, who had been obviously that person for many years, and now he's passed on. So they all want to be part of the funeral. So they all got together, made the trip to Canaan for the funeral of Jacob or Israel.
And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, and there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians, wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan.
So according to these verses, there was a site picked out to perform the funeral, and it's referred to as the threshing floor of Atad. Right? Now, a threshing floor was typically a flat area that was set aside for like separating grain. Maybe people would do it with their feet or whatever, so it had to be flat in order for it to work right. So I guess that's why it was a good location to do this. Assumedly it was large enough, or again, whether it was the shape of a rectangle or an oval or whatever it was, you know, it was a large flat area that could be used for the funeral. So they did that. It says they came to this threshing floor in a place called Atad. You know, they mourned with a very great and sore lamentation, mourning for this father 7 days. Okay, so that was the period of the funeral here, right? It was the mourning period, what we might now call like the wake, right, or the viewing. See, this, whereas today in our lifetime, it's getting less and less and less. I mean, forgetting even about COVID, even before that, it was down to just really like a day or even half a day that was done for this, right? But years ago, I mean, I go back long enough where it was 2 or 3 days, of viewing and wake, whereas here it was 7 days. So this was the period of time that they went through the mourning, right? And so now it mentions in verse 11 that the Canaanites, the ones who lived round about, were watching this go on, but not necessarily understanding who it was or anything. And they saw people dressed in Egyptian clothes. Certainly all the ones who were the Egyptians were dressed that way, and perhaps Joseph and perhaps others. I mean, they've been living in Egypt for 17 years, so they were dressed in Egyptian garb. So they were confused, thought, well, a bunch of people from Egypt came to mourn for somebody here. It must have been somebody important to them. So that's why it says this is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. It says, wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, right? And so they, at least for this point, changed the name of Atad to Abel Mizraim, right? And now I don't know that necessarily means it was changed forever, or that anybody else would have referred to it that way, whether it was just called that for a period of time, you don't know. But the point being that they were recognizing this was some great event, that to them it was a whole bunch of Egyptians mourning somebody important, so they wanted to change the name to something that meant that. In this case, that name, Abel Mizraim, means mourning of Egypt. So that's why they picked that for a name, so it recognized what was happening in that place at that particular time.
And his sons did unto him according as he commanded them, for his sons carried him into the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with the field for a possession of a burying place of Ephron the Hittite before Mamre. And Joseph returned into Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father after he had buried his father.
So 12 says his sons did unto him according as he commanded them, which basically means that they buried him where he asked to be buried. And in 13 it talks about doing that. They carried his body to the land of Canaan, buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham had bought with the field for a possession of a burying place from Ephron the Hittite before Mamre, right? And I think we had mentioned in an earlier chapter about that there was a whole chapter earlier devoted to Abraham finding this cave and picking out this place when Sarah had died, and he purchased it and buried her there. And I had commented how they devoted a whole chapter to the purchase of a burial place for Sarah. And it seemed maybe a little out of place, or maybe a little bit of overkill to give that much detail to it. But then you realize later that here not only was Sarah buried there, Abraham was buried there, Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, the one wife of Jacob, was buried there, right? So it was a family plot. So this was where Jacob wanted to be buried. So it says the sons did as he had commanded or asked, and they went ahead and followed through. They had brought his body to Canaan, buried him in that cave. And then when they're done, in verse 14, Joseph returned to Egypt. He and his brethren, everybody went back as they promised they would. So they did what they had to do. They had the funeral. They buried their father as has been requested of them, or as they had sworn to do, and then returned to Egypt to pick up with their lives there.
And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sin, for they did unto thee evil, and now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants.
Now, a very interesting thing happens after this is all done. Jacob has passed away, he's been buried, right? And now in 15 says, when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, he was gone, that they became afraid. They became afraid that now Joseph was going to somehow use his influence in Egypt, his position, whatever, to exact some type of revenge against them for what they had done to him all those years earlier. In other words, perhaps they thought, well, he just didn't do it for the sake of our father, that he didn't want to hurt his father by doing that. And I think we had assumed that even another time that his father probably never even found out that that happened, right? Because if Jacob had known what his other sons did to his favorite son, surely he wouldn't have left them any land or inheritance of any type. So, we kind of assumed that Jacob probably never found out. So that now the brothers are thinking, wow, okay, Joseph kept this to himself all the time, but now that our father's gone, now he's going to get back at us. Now something bad's going to happen, that we're going to be made to pay for what we did back then. Now, when I read something like that, or hear something like that, what I typically think of is that, when people assume that others will act in a certain way, in a certain situation, a lot of times it's a reflection of what they themselves would do in the same situation. So that's the kind of the way that I take this, is that, perhaps any of these brothers would think, hey, if anybody did that to me, I would get back at them. I would get some kind of revenge. I wouldn't let that go. So therefore they assume that Joseph would be the same, that he's just been biding his time, waiting for this opportunity to get some revenge against them. Now, of course, we know it's not true, because that's not how Joseph was, but that's what I think of, is that they were projecting onto him what their own actions would have been, what their own desires would have been. Okay, so this is what they're thinking in 15. So in 16 it says, they sent a messenger to Joseph with a message. And again, this was an interesting way of approaching it. They said, listen, our father gave us instructions before he died. Right? He says, thy father did command before he died, saying, tell Joseph not to take revenge against his brothers. All right? So that's what they're saying, right? That they actually send a message to Joseph saying, you know what, your father said to us, or our father said to us, tell Joseph not to be mad or take revenge against us for what we did to you. So Joseph is getting this note saying, are you kidding me? Right? Like I just said, almost surely Jacob didn't even know what happened, so why would Jacob be writing a note to them saying, tell Joseph, don't take revenge against his brothers? If anything, if Jacob wanted to say anything, he would have said it to Joseph directly. Why would he send a note to the brothers saying, tell Joseph this? It doesn't make any sense. So that was their attempt, was to use the father and make it like a dying wish, the same way in the first half of the chapter here that Jacob's real dying wish was to be buried in Canaan, so that carried a lot of weight, that they went to all that trouble to transport his body and embalm it and transport it and so forth to bury it. So now the brother's trying to slip in another one, right? So, well, okay, if that dying wish made all that happen, so now if we throw in another dying wish that our father said to Joseph, don't take revenge against your brothers, that then he'll follow it just because our father said it, right? Again, total silliness, right? And at the end of verse 17, it says, Joseph wept when they spake unto him, right? Now, and in 18 it goes as far as saying his brethren went and fell down before his face, said, behold, we'll be your servants, and so forth, right? Now it says that Joseph wept at this. Now why would he weep? See, to me it's because he's probably thinking, is that who you think I am? You really think that I've been like two-faced all these years and just pretending to forgive you? And that the whole scene where we wept and embraced and so forth, and I forgave you, that was all a show, just for the sake of not upsetting my father. And then now he's gone, now I'm going to turn into basically what you were years ago and start taking revenge against you, right? That's why he wept. Because by this point I'm sure he had really forgiven them, and 17 years had passed, so it's basically forgotten. Maybe not totally ever forgotten, but it was forgotten that it wasn't even an issue anymore. Here he thought we have a great relationship, me and all my brothers, and here you're going to come to me and that's the way you felt all this time, that I was just faking it, that I was waiting for my father to die and now I'm going to get back at you? That's why he wept. It was kind of an emotional thing to hear. I thought this was all resolved, and yet you're still keeping it fresh and like just waiting for the other shoe to drop. So he sees that they're groveling here and so forth. Of course, again, his dream was that they would bow down before him, but he's just kind of upset that they would think that of him. So he's going to straighten that out here in the verses to come.
And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them.
So Joseph's response to what they're saying and doing, in verse 19, says, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God?" Now, what does he mean by that? I mean, to me, a couple things. Right? I mean, one is just the whole bowing down to the earth and so forth. I mean, if you're going to bow down to anybody, bow down to God. Don't bow down to me. I'm your brother. Right? And then secondly, all this, asking for forgiveness and stuff. We've already done it. You already asked me for forgiveness. I already forgave you. So what are we talking about? If you really still feel guilty, then repent to God. Take your guilty feelings to God and repent to Him. Why are you putting me in the place of God? So if you really feel guilty, then that means you need God to forgive you. You need to repent before Him and let Him forgive you and let you feel that peace that comes with your guilt being swept away and such. I can't do that for you. I've already forgiven you. So take it to God. Don't put me in God's place as if I'm in charge of absolving you. I've already forgiven you. That's the best I can do. Anymore, you need to go to God. Right? And now in 20, he phrases something he had said earlier in a little different way. And this is usually the way that I quote it anyway. It says, you thought evil against me back then, but God meant it unto good. See, that's the way that he put it, right? That, again, it's not excusing what they did. I mean, what they did was evil, and they meant it for evil. They meant to either kill him or get rid of him or whatever, to put him in a position where he had to be in slavery and eventually wound up in prison. So, yeah, I mean, they meant it for evil because they hated him, but God used it for good. He used it for the purpose of him being in Egypt at the right time, for him to be able to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, and to be able to design and implement a system whereby food could be saved and then distributed to people and keep people alive. That's what it says. He meant it for good, to bring the past as the days, to save much people alive. All right? So there was a purpose in it. You meant it for evil, God used it for good. Right? Doesn't mean you should pat yourself on the back and say, see, I was used by God. No. You meant it for evil, but God used it for good. So I personally can't hold it against you. But if you feel a need for repentance and forgiveness, then bring it to God and let Him forgive you of what you did. And then he, adds in verse 21, kind of, to end this, it says that, now, don't be afraid, all right? Don't worry, I'm going to, treat you like family as we are, you and your little ones. It says he comforted them, spoke kindly to them, right? Did the best he could to put them at ease. I'm not angry. I'm not going to seek revenge. Don't be afraid. We're brothers. I forgave you years ago. So let's just never mention this again, right? Let's be a family. Now our father's gone. Let's be a family and move forward together as a family.
And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt.
So now we're going to fast forward a bunch of years, right? And it comes to the point where Joseph is now 110 years old. It says Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, means all of his brothers, all their families, and Joseph lived 110 years in total. Right? And he lived long enough, as it says in verse 23, it says, Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, which would mean Ephraim's great-grandchildren, so therefore Joseph's great-great-grandchildren. So that's how long he lived, long enough to see that much of his family. Right? Now in verse 24, he's saying to his brethren, I guess whoever is left at this point, I don't know that they all outlived him necessarily, but he says, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land of Canaan, which he sware to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right now, again, when he's saying you, he doesn't mean you, his brothers, because it would be still quite a ways in the future until the house of Israel would return to Canaan, right? But meaning their descendants, their family. So so don't worry, we're all here now, but eventually the family's going to return to Canaan, the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what's going to happen in the future. I'm not going there, obviously, because I'm going to die right here, and and likely they all did as well. but eventually our families will return. And so in 25, Joseph mentions what's going to happen to his own body, all right? See, similar to Jacob, it's his intention that his body would be buried in the land of Canaan. However, different than Jacob, he's not going to make them swear or insist that, bring my body back before it, like right away, drop everything, go have the funeral there and bury me there. He's not going to insist on that. Rather, he's saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. In other words, at some point, whatever's left of me, my bones by that point, can be carried on to Canaan for the burial when the time comes. Right? It says, when God will surely visit you. And again, he's not saying you who were right in front of me, but your descendants, whoever is around at that time, comprising the house of Israel. And that particular event happens to be recorded in Exodus chapter 13, right, which was, of course, at the time of Moses, and the house of Israel was in bondage in Goshen in Egypt, and eventually Moses was employed by God to lead them out of Egypt. And so when they did so, in Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, it says, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, that Joseph is talking about, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones away hence with you. So basically quoting this verse 25 in Exodus 13:19, saying that Moses, or the people he was overseeing, made sure to take the bones of Joseph with them to be buried in the land of Canaan, because Joseph had said it from way back years before that that's what would happen. So that came about. All right, and in fact, if you've ever watched the movie, The 10 Commandments, there's a small part where that's mentioned, right, in the scene where they're all getting ready to go and everybody's packing up the wagons and so forth. You see a few people carrying like a coffin or along with them, and then somebody says, well, what's that? And then someone says, that's the bones of Joseph, right? Because they were bringing it with them to be buried in the land of Canaan, which was his request. But he said it didn't have to be now. It could wait until that time, which was then carried out. So finally, in verse 26, it says Joseph dies at 110 years old. They embalmed him to preserve his body for a while, and then his bones would be still able to be transported when the time came. It says he was put in a coffin in Egypt, which would have been the coffin that was carried then out of Egypt when the time came. So Joseph lived to be 110 years old. The first part of his life was difficult. Right after being age 17, he spent 13 years in slavery and in prison until he turned 30. And although that was a chunk of his life, yet he lived another 80 years beyond that. 80 years of a productive life, of a life that blessed and touched many people, of a life that made a great difference for the people of Egypt, but also for the whole house of Israel, that they were all preserved because God used Joseph during that time. So even though the beginning of his life, it looked as if, what, did God forget me? But no, God was planning a much greater calling and use for Joseph's life, which the last 80 years of his life were used for that. So he lived to be 110, was put in the coffin to await the time when his bones would be carried into Egypt during the exodus from Egypt back to the land of Canaan.